Hi everyone, my name is Mikhail Rodin, and this is historical channel Прошлое, which means the past. And I am happy to introduce you to our new project called Crossroads 2. The aim of this project is to promote collaboration and knowledge exchange between American and Russian archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, and environmental scientists, focusing on studying human-environmental relationships in the Arctic and subarctic regions of North America and Eurasia. This is the virtual extension of the Crossroads of Continents, Cultures of Siberia and Alaska project. It took place at the end of the Cold War era and facilitated collaboration between Soviet and American scientists. We are doing it in collaboration with archaeologists Igor Chechушkov and Ivan Semyan. And today, Dr. William Fitzhugh of the Smithsonian Institution, who was one of the key participants of the original Crossroads project, will talk about the links between Arctic people and how overseas research helps us to understand their past.
Yes, my name is Bill Fitzhugh. I'm a curator of Northern Archaeology and Ethnography in the Smithsonian Institution in its Department of Anthropology. I'm sort of an expert, I guess you might say, in the circumpolar peoples around the world. My job here at the Smithsonian is to curate and take care of the northern collections, spanning mostly from Labrador all the way to Alaska and into northern Russia and Scandinavia. I began my work in Labrador and Newfoundland. I spent maybe 20 or 30 years and still actually am involved in research in those areas. But the familiarity with the Eskimo history in those areas led me to wonder where these cultures originated. And that brought me across Canada into Alaska, where the birthplace of most of the Eskimo cultures took place, and also into Siberia and northern Russia, because many of the influences that formed those Eskimo and Inuit cultures took place with interactions with the cultures of Russia and Siberia. So I've had quite a bit of field experience in northern Russia, working with Russian colleagues. I've worked with people in Japan, a lot in Alaska and Canada, and I've been very interested in how these cultures developed over time, and it's quite a long time period that they've lived in the north. We've studied the climate changes, the environmental shifts that took place over the last 10,000 years, and actually in Russia, those histories go way back to 30 and 40,000 years ago. But most of my work is more recent. I've been especially working on the contact of these northern peoples with the Europeans, either in North America or Eurasians, to see how they're influenced by the cultures that was living to the south of them. And then looking at the spread of technologies and ideas that allowed these people to occupy the Arctic area and to eventually spread around the circumpolar area from northern Russia and Siberia into Alaska, across Canada to Labrador and Greenland. And so that's turned out to be a fascinating study project. Took me to many different places. I met many wonderful colleagues and people, some of the indigenous people. I lived for a while with the Yamal Nenets for a while. And so I've had fair experience with the North and its people and cultures. Unfortunately, only during the summer seasons, because as an archaeologist, that's the time when you can actually find some unfrozen ground. So I'm not too familiar with the winter life and haven't lived in the north during the winter periods, but quite familiar with the summer seasons and how people have lived as reindeer herders or hunters or fishermen throughout the area. And the big interest that I've always had is how do these cultures relate to each other? We have many different ethnographic tribes that live in various territories across Russia, Siberia, Scandinavia, and North America. They all are very distinctive. They have their own clothing and designs. They have their own histories. But if you go back in time, you find that there are these cultures kind of merge into proto-cultures that were more similar with each other than the native peoples are in these areas today. And we learn about this through excavating archaeological sites, comparing things that we find, and reconstructing the histories as best we can. And the knowledge that the indigenous people have had about their oral history, their traditions and technology and so forth, that is, of course, crucial to any understanding of the North. You really have to start with what the people are doing in these areas today. And as we say in the social science area, upstreaming. So that is essentially looking at how they're living today and comparing that with what we have from the most recent archaeological data. And then into more distant times, you begin to lose the thread a little bit, but at least you have some information grounding about how people can and have lived in the North. And there are not that many opportunities. There's a lot of common elements. There's a lot of common animals all through the Circumpolar North. So many of these cultures have developed ways, similar ways to hunt and travel and live in these areas. And those are the common threads that link many of these different cultures together. So that's what we're going to be exploring in some of these programs that we're doing. We will look into the history of these northern peoples, how they're connected to the living peoples in their areas today, and then how archaeological work can help understand their history and maybe a little bit about their future.
How did you become interested in anthropology and archaeology of the North?
My initial interest began in Labrador, which is quite a beautiful country north of Newfoundland, kind of transitional between the Arctic and the subarctic. And I did a PhD study there, and it was fascinating. Had 10,000 years of history and prehistory, and much of that history in the last 4,000 years was involving the Inuit people, or the Paleo-Inuit, and their ethnographic descendants. So we've always been wondering where they originated. Because they arrived in Labrador 4,000 years ago. The most recent expression of that culture, the Thule culture, moved into Labrador only around 1500 AD. And we knew that they were culturally very related to the Alaskan Eskimos and those of northern Canada, and migrated most recently around 1,000 years ago into the Canadian Arctic. So we usually go back to Alaska to hunt for the origins of these people. And the history of Eskimo archaeology and occupations in those areas only goes back about 2,000 years. Before that, we kind of lose the trail because of various problems with land submergence and so forth. But we did see a lot of connections further to the east among the native peoples of Russia and Siberia, particularly the northern areas. Many of the art forms that we see in the earliest Eskimo cultures in Alaska around 2,000 years ago suggest ties with some of the Central Asian groups, like the Scythians, like some of the Iron Age and Bronze Age populations of the Far East, of Mongolia and Russia. And so I began interested in how do we learn more about those people, and the result of that was a big conference and a big exhibit that we did called the Crossroads of Continents exhibit, in which we engaged Russian partners, then Soviet partners, and we built a big exhibit project that was seen in North America, traveled around all over. It took about 10 years to produce, using the collections of the Smithsonian, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography in St. Petersburg, and the scholars of those institutions, the Russian Academy of Sciences, were particularly important. Sergei Oruchunov was the key person Sergei Serov, another one. And as a result of that project, it took 10 years and then another 4 or 5 years for traveling around. I got very familiar with the Russian anthropology area, the people, the collections. Spent quite a bit of time in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and then later on was able to visit areas in the Russian Far East. So that project really opened up the possibility of studying the collections, the archaeological and ethnographic material from northern Russia. And it culminated in the 1990s in some work we did surveying with Russian colleagues, Bitulko and Golovnev, across the Russian north, flying in An-2 airplanes, puddle jumpers, from one place to another. We went from Yamal all the way to Bering Strait. I met many, native people and Russians and occupying those areas. It was a wonderful experience, and it led me to more information about the Iron Age and Bronze Age cultures of the area. What we were finding is actually that these connections, which had been supposed to be the kind of like the deep origins of Eskimo cultures, were actually not the origins of Eskimo cultures as we knew them from Bering Sea and the Far East, but more the local populations of those areas. And while I learned a huge amount and wrote numbers of papers with my colleagues in this work, we decided that the trail of the Eskimos is not going to be across Arctic Russia. It's got separate histories, focused in Scandinavia and along the Russian coast. But in the Far East areas, from Bering Strait to the Bering Sea, Aleutians, Chukotka, and ultimately into the Amur River and northern Japan and to Mongolia. So for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been working in the archaeology of Bronze Age Mongolia, particularly with some of the Iron Age and Bronze Age cultures there, to try to see if we could find this thread of information, of style, of objects, of way of life, of thinking, of shamanism, and so forth, how we can connect the early Eskimo and North Pacific cultures with the cultures of Mongolia at about the same time. So that's been a very interesting kind of overview of where I've been and some of the reasons why I think this circumpolar archaeology is a very, very special area, particularly today when we have climate change and the open Arctic Sea is changing the entire globe. So it's a very exciting time to be looking into the history of these northern peoples and Central Asian peoples and how they've related and developed and influenced the history of North American peoples as well.
Tell us please about the history of your collaborations with scholars from the then Soviet Union and Russia.
As a result of our interest in circumpolar areas and the lack of knowledge from half of the world in northern Eurasia, I was very interested in seeing what we could do to break open that nut. It had been kind of like a problem. Other archaeologists and anthropologists have been trying to do this before, but we were very fortunate in that a time occurred in the Russian history where we were able to get access, where we were able to travel to study in the northern parts of Eurasia easier than we had before. So we proposed at the Smithsonian, an exhibit and a research project called Crossroads of Continents. Crossroads of Continents really referred to the North Pacific region between Alaska and Chukotka, where there's only 50 or 60 miles, 100 kilometers or so between the territories of Russia and Alaska, and an area that was very critical to the formation of Eskimo cultures. We weren't the first people to start, be curious about this. The story goes way back to Franz Boas, the famous early American anthropologist who was at the Museum of the Natural History, Natural History Museum in New York City. And he established a Circum-Pacific project called the Jessup II expedition. And Jessup was a funder and a leader of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and he put up the money and the infrastructure to create a study project that looked at the North Pacific region to see what could be determined about the history of its people. And this involved both American and Russian scholars, some Polish origin, Germanic origin, and others. It was a huge project. Jessup expedition gathered data from the Amur River in northern Hokkaido, Kamchatka, Chukotka, all around the North Pacific, including Alaska, down into the northwest coast areas of Canada and the Puget Sound areas of northwestern North America. Many of these areas had similar features of their cultures, although they all had very different ethnographic peoples, today. There were elements that suggested that in former times there were more connections than we've had, during the period when the Cold War made it impossible for people to work across Bering Strait. So we gathered together a team of Russians and Americans and Canadians, and we studied the collections, especially those collections in the St. Petersburg Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography. They had wonderful materials, and surprisingly, of course, what we were most interested in their material were the collections that they had gathered during the Russian America period and brought back lots of Northwest Coast and Alaskan, Eskimo, and Aleut and other tribes, collections, mostly ethnographic material, back to St. Petersburg. And on the other hand, the American museums had quite a bit of material from the Boaz expeditions from the 1987 to 92. Sorry, the 1997 to I'm in the wrong century here. From the late 1800s to early 1900s, lots of ethnographic material collected by a number of Russian anthropologists, Jessup and various others, Yokelson and many others. So the best Russian collections from that area were available in New York, and the best and least known American collections from Canada and Alaska were in St. Petersburg. So we actually were made possible the joining of these two collections by mixing them together, by bringing scholars, Russian scholars, Soviet Russian scholars, Canadians and American scholars together to work on these collections in a very integrated way. And Crossroads was both a big exhibition which combined the studies of those cultures and materials, comparing them with each other, as well as scholarly activity that resulted in a major monograph called Crossroads of Cultures, called Crossroads of Continents, Cultures of Siberia and Alaska. So it carried forth the kind of Boasian curiosity about how these cultures developed and how they were related to each other, what were their differences, and so forth. And it stimulated, a post-Crossroads collaboration between the Russian scholars that we met and knew well now, and the collections from that project has continued right up into the present. So it became a founding element of our collaboration and the importance of internationalism in the study of these, the cultures of the northern areas. And this is the one place in the world where the two continents, the peoples of these two continents, could mix rather easily across a very narrow piece of land, much smaller, much less distant than, say, between Scandinavia and Greenland, Europe and Greenland. So there's thousands of miles there, and even if you jump across Iceland and Greenland, it's still quite far. So we knew that we had this one place where the peoples of the world were in much closer contact than anywhere else. And this is a really important feature of the whole North American native history. Everyone we know of so far is coming into North America via Bering Strait, and either in the Ice Age period when there was a land bridge, or during the more recent times when either travel over the ice or water was relatively easy to do.
What is the purpose of continuing the project, and why is it called Crossroads 2?
So our early history working with the Russians and others in Eurasia, including Scandinavian, Crossroads, the Crossroads of Continents project really enabled us to get to know people and know something more about the collections, but it only opened the can, if you will say. It left so many questions unanswered, and so to continue that progress in understanding the northern areas, we've proposed that we continue another phase. We call it Crossroads 2, an educational program to try to explore the history that we've been discussing a little bit of these northern peoples, and particularly in the Asian side, Eurasian side of the world. My recent work in Mongolia since around 2001 has brought a lot of information. They've made a lot of information available on the cultures of this very interesting area in the steppe regions, and we're exploring especially the Iron and Bronze Age, but we also are interested in the Neolithic and the Paleolithic time periods as well. This is a part of the world where cultural mixing has been going on for a long, long time. The Central Plateau in this part of Inner Asia is very high, so it's quite cold, and very cold winters. There's a lot of permafrost. People have domesticated reindeer in these areas. That seems to have spread from the northern Mongolia, South Russian areas into other parts of the north. And then there's these great steppe connections that occur across the open plains and steppes, particularly the high altitude areas, all the way from Korea west into the Altai Mountains and across into even as far as Turkey and Eastern Europe and so forth. So the great grasslands of this area have been a conduit of cultures and communication that is sort of similar to the kind of environmental conditions that occurred, much farther north, where we had tundra and open country, and enabling people to travel by land, by sled or boat, across vast regions. So the steppe areas provided that same sort of connection between peoples, and has been shown from archaeological work. There are great connections that start in the Neolithic and Bronze Age up into Genghis Khan, the Turkic expansion earlier, and so forth. So this area has been a kind of like, if you will, a crossroads of Asia, Inner Asia, because it's connecting the peoples east and west. It's connecting the regions of the south, like China and India, into the central parts of Russia. There are major river systems that enable communication as well as land travel and so forth. People had a remarkable ability to build canoes and boats and vehicles, which allowed them to travel long distances over the water courses. Many of these rivers in Russia travel north-south, draining the highland interior areas to the Arctic Ocean, and many have very small distances between them and headwaters that drain the other way. So these areas have been very, very crucial to the development of cultures in all areas. There have been cross-fertilization. There's been many population expansions and replacements. Languages and technologies have shifted and moved. So this is an area that we're really would like to focus on. It's an area where it's possible to have and important to have international collaboration, to be discussing these things across borders, to be accessing collections, data, and talking with our colleagues. And we're very fortunate now that translation systems make it much easier for different languages to participate in these kind of discussions, either directly or to be, doing it in person. And we have the technology now through the internet to really expand the kind of discussions which we have never been able to do, except in the old days when, say, Henry Collins went to the early meetings in Europe, met the first Russian colleagues of his at that time. You had to cross an ocean and spend lots of money. And today we have this miracle of global communication as an asset. So we'd like to take advantage of that and be able to access our colleagues and through our colleagues to educate the world as best we can about the reasons why people need to keep talking, why they need to keep channels of communication open, why we need to support each other in our work, share information, and learn together as we move forward. So Crossroads 2 is going to be an exploration of how we can do this at a particular time in history now when there are some things that make it a little bit more difficult, but we do have technology, and that is really helping us to spread the word, no matter what the political differences between countries might be.
Thank you for watching us. In the next series of the Crossroads 2 project, we will talk about polar hunting technologies, horse domestication, and so on. My name is Mikhail Rodin, it was Прошлое channel and Crossroads 2 project. Thank you for supporting our channel. See you soon.